Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shows, debt slaves, search, peasants, vassals, minions, beat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to the Middle East, talk about ISIS. And all these different sources that have come out recently that talk about the connections between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, United States, and ISIS and or Al-Qaeda. And so very interesting the fact that these are the kind of things that used to be talked about as conspiracy theory that become more and more conspiracy fact. And in fact, it was kind of outrageous to make those connections in the months and years previously, but now seems to be common knowledge to some extent. And that's a lot like a lot of different policies that the United States has had around the world that a lot of people out there know more about them, where it's happening, than necessarily people do here in the United States. But one of the people who sees the connection and has seen all along is a foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, who's talked about that the U.S. has backed Islamic terrorism from Ronald Reagan all the way to Obama, which is very true, although it turns out that President Carter actually was the one that got the wheels turning. But the fact is Russia knows that the United States has been using mujahideen and Islamic militants for quite some time. Certainly their experience in Afghanistan would bear that out. But so anyway, we have that one source, and then there's another email that was leaked, one of the Hillary Clinton emails that was leaked that talks about the fact that she's well aware and has been for many years that supposed U.S. allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, have been supporting ISIS, funding ISIS and arming ISIS. And so the fact is that people in the United States government certainly know about that connection. And once again, it makes this whole relationship between the United States and ISIS and Al-Qaeda all the more suspect and interesting and complex. And then we have another source that came out recently, a former CIA contractor, Stephen Kelly, and he said that, quote, the U.S. has always been the main sponsor of ISIS, the Islamic State, unquote, and that he purports that Washington is pretending to be fighting ISIS, which are charges that we've heard leveled before. He goes on to say that, quote, the U.S. has always been the main sponsor of ISIS, so the charade that they are having anything to do with fighting ISIS in Syria is a complete farce. Everything coming out of the U.S. State Department is a complete and utter balderdash, unquote. So that's really not hard to believe. But of course, any source like this can be suspect. He goes on to say also that, quote, the U.S. Can reconstruct, rearm, and resupply ISIS, unquote. So once again, former CIA contractor, somebody directly involved in this training process of members of ISIS and or Al-Qaeda, is talking about the fact that the United States is a sponsor and supporter on many levels to both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the last one is this interesting one from the interview with an al-Nusra commander. Once again, we don't know exactly how reliable the source is, but this al-Nusra commander talks about the fact that, quote, the Americans stand on our side, unquote, and said that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait are financing, and the United States is involved, and that we are all part of Al-Qaeda, he says, unquote. So, once again, we find the United States, for whatever convenience, involved in both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, supposedly our enemies, but becoming friends of convenience in the theater of war, particularly regime change in Syria at this moment. And then he goes on to say, quote, that Israel is now supporting us because Israel is at war with Syria and Hezbollah, unquote. So he also brings Israel into the picture of supporting Al-Qaeda. And we also know that Israel's been involved in supporting ISIS, for no other reason than the hospital treatment, medical treatment that ISIS and Al-Qaeda members are receiving in Israeli hospitals in the Golan Heights, for one. And he says that, quote, America has also it's changed its opinion of us. So in spite of 9/11, this Al-Qaeda member can speak about the fact that the United States has now changed their opinion of their arch enemies and supposedly the whole reason for this war on terror. Quote, he says, he goes on to say, quote, originally ISIS and us, Al-Qaeda, were one group, but ISIS were used by big states like America. Their leaders all work with secret security services, unquote. And that's something we've talked about before as well, that the rank and file of ISIS doesn't necessarily need to know that they're under U.S. direction. The United States only needs to work with its leaders, and uses a lot of special forces members and the like in the theater in Syria to make this happen. So it's very likely that ISIS can be the puppets of Western states. He goes on to say, quote, the U.S. supports the opposition, but not directly. They support the countries which support us, unquote. And so once again, saying that the United States likes to keep its distance and plausible deniability by laying it all on the feet of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait, financing and supporting this operation. So the U.S. is involved, but the fact is that Saudi Arabia and Qatar and those countries are even more deeply involved, and the U.S. well knows it. So they just support those countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, in their efforts. But then he goes on to say that, quote, TOW missiles are given directly to us by the United States. We had officers from Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S., unquote, there. And so that's very telling. Once again, the same players that we have discussed all along be involved in supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS being used as proxies for whatever kind of foreign policies being pursued in the Middle East. We saw the battlefield change considerably when al-Nusra Front, supposedly the moderate rebels, were given TOW missiles and were able to go in the battlefield more heavily armed. And so this is interesting too, in light of the fact that we've had al-Nusra theoretically deny its connections with Al-Qaeda and change its name, but the fact is this guy comes out and says that they're essentially the same organization with the same principles and same goals, and they are still Al-Qaeda. But like I say, that last comment was the most telling, talking about the players that we've known all along are involved: Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. So now we seem to get confirmation from all kinds of different sources, and now it seems almost anticlimactic because we've been pointing this out for a long time, months and years, and now we just get further confirmation. So what does it all mean? Well, we'll find out as this tragedy in Syria continues to unfold. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.